June 21, 1944. The dark waters of the Celebes Sea stretched endlessly beneath a quarter moon, their surface broken only by the gentle wake of a steel predator moving through the depths. At 180 feet below the tropical night, the USS Harder cut through the blackness like a metallic shark, her hull reverberating with the steady hum of electric motors and the distant ping of sonar echoes. Inside her cramped control room, the air hung thick with the smell of diesel fuel, human sweat, and the metallic tang of pressurized oxygen. Lieutenant Commander Samuel David Dealey stood motionless behind the periscope, his weathered hands gripping the brass handles as he studied the surface through the narrow lens. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft whisper of air through the ventilation systems and the occasional creak of steel under pressure. Above them, somewhere in the darkness, Japanese destroyers prowled the shipping lanes with deadly confidence. These were not merchant vessels or transport ships, but the Imperial Navy's finest warships, armed with depth charges and hydrophones, their crews trained in the ancient art of submarine hunting. For months, American submarine operations in these waters had been considered suicide missions. The Japanese had turned the Celebes Sea into their private hunting ground, a watery graveyard where Allied submarines came to die. The conventional wisdom among naval strategists was clear. Avoid shallow waters, avoid destroyer patrols, and never engage multiple enemy warships in succession. Samuel Dealey was about to prove that conventional wisdom could be spectacularly wrong. The USS Harder was a Gato-class submarine, 312 feet of welded steel and precision engineering that represented the pinnacle of American submarine design. Her hull, constructed from high-tensile steel plates and reinforced with internal frames, could withstand crushing pressures at depths exceeding 300 feet. Her propulsion system combined 4 Fairbanks Morse diesel engines for surface operations, with battery-powered electric motors for submerged running, giving her a surface speed of 20 knots and an underwater endurance of 48 hours. Her armament consisted of 24 Mark 14 torpedoes, each weighing over 3,000 pounds, and packed with 643 pounds of high explosive. These weapons utilized sophisticated gyroscopic guidance systems and magnetic influence detonators, though their reliability had proven frustratingly inconsistent throughout the first years of the Pacific War. Many submarine commanders had watched in horror as their torpedoes struck enemy hulls only to fail to detonate, or veered wildly off course due to faulty guidance mechanisms. Samuel Dealey himself was a study in contrasts, a soft-spoken Texan whose calm demeanor masked the calculating mind of a natural predator. Born in Dallas in 1906, he had graduated from the Naval Academy at Annapolis and spent years perfecting the art of underwater warfare. His fellow officers described him as a man who spoke in measured tones but thought with lightning speed, capable of making split-second tactical decisions while maintaining an almost supernatural calm under pressure. The crew of the Harder had developed an almost religious faith in their captain's judgment, having witnessed his uncanny ability to anticipate enemy movements and exploit weaknesses in their defensive patterns. They called him the Mad Texan, though his madness was purely tactical, a willingness to engage enemy forces in situations where conventional commanders would retreat. The mission parameters for this patrol were both simple and impossibly dangerous. Japanese naval forces were using Balikpapan as a staging area for reinforcement operations, sending destroyer squadrons through the Celebes Sea to support air operations over Borneo. These were the same skies where Major Richard Bong was establishing his legend as America's greatest fighter ace, shooting down Japanese aircraft with methodical precision. But while Bong dominated the air, the sea lanes remained firmly under Imperial Navy control. American intelligence had identified a critical vulnerability in the Japanese supply chain. Their destroyers were operating on predictable schedules, following established routes that brought them through relatively shallow waters where submarine operations were considered impossible. The Harder's orders were to intercept and destroy these reinforcement convoys, disrupting Japanese operations throughout the region. It was, by any reasonable measure, a suicide mission. At 0347 hours on the morning of June 21st, Sonneman third-class Chester Hoyle detected the distinctive sound signature of a Japanese destroyer approaching from the northeast. The rhythmic thrum of twin screws and high-speed turbines was unmistakable, growing stronger with each passing minute as the enemy warship closed distance. Dealey moved to the plotting table where his executive officer, Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, was calculating intercept coordinates based on the sonar bearings. The enemy vessel was identified as a Fubuki-class destroyer, one of Japan's most formidable anti-submarine platforms, armed with depth charges and equipped with sophisticated hydrophone arrays capable of detecting submerged submarines at considerable range. Her crew would be experienced veterans, men who had spent years hunting American submarines in these same waters. The attack approach required absolute precision and no small amount of courage. Dealey ordered the Harder to rise to periscope depth, bringing her within 60 feet of the surface, where detection became exponentially more likely. Through the narrow lens of the periscope, he could see the Japanese destroyer clearly now, her dark silhouette cutting through the moonlit water at approximately 18 knots. She was approximately 4,000 yards away and closing, her bow throwing white spray as she maintained a steady course toward Balikpapan. The range was perfect for a torpedo attack, but the angle was challenging, requiring precise calculations to account for the target's speed and bearing. Dealey ordered the torpedo room to prepare tubes 1 and 2, while the plotting team calculated the precise firing solution needed to intercept the enemy vessel. But the Mark 14 torpedoes that represented America's primary submarine weapon carried a dark secret that had been claiming American lives for nearly 3 years. Despite their sophisticated design and advanced guidance systems, they suffered from multiple critical defects that had never been properly addressed during peacetime testing. Their magnetic influence detonators frequently malfunctioned, causing premature explosions or complete failures to detonate. Their depth control mechanisms were unreliable, sending torpedoes beneath their intended targets or causing them to run too shallow. Most frustratingly, their contact detonators often failed upon direct impact, particularly when striking at the perpendicular angles that were most tactically advantageous. These problems had been reported by submarine commanders throughout the Pacific Fleet, but bureaucratic inertia and testing inadequacies had prevented effective solutions from being implemented. At 0352 hours, with the range closing to 3,000 yards, Dealey gave the order to fire. 2 Mark 14 torpedoes erupted from the Harder's forward tubes, their compressed air systems launching them toward the unsuspecting Japanese destroyer with deadly precision. The weapons ran hot, straight, and normal for the first 2,000 yards of their journey, their gyroscopic guidance systems maintaining perfect course toward the target. Dealey watched through the periscope as white wakes stretched across the dark water, converging on the enemy warship like invisible fingers of death. The timing was perfect, the angle ideal, and the range optimal for maximum probability of hit. For 37 seconds, everything proceeded according to plan. The first torpedo struck the destroyer's hull just forward of her bridge, exactly where Dealey had aimed it. The weapon had traveled over 2 miles through the ocean depths, guided by mechanical precision and American engineering, to impact its target with devastating force. But instead of the massive explosion that should have torn through the enemy warship's vital machinery spaces, there was only a dull clang as the torpedo's warhead failed to detonate. The magnetic influence detonator had malfunctioned, and the backup contact mechanism had proven equally useless. The second torpedo missed entirely, passing beneath the destroyer's keel due to depth control failure, its warhead detonating harmlessly against the ocean floor 300 yards beyond the target. In the space of 60 seconds, Samuel Dealey had witnessed the complete failure of American torpedo technology, watching nearly 7,000 pounds of high explosives prove utterly ineffective against a single enemy warship. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. Hydrophone operators aboard the destroyer had detected the torpedo wakes and quickly triangulated the Harder's approximate position. Within minutes, the enemy warship was racing toward the submarine's location at flank speed, her depth charge crews preparing their deadly cargo for release. The destroyer's sonar systems painted the ocean with acoustic energy, probing for the American submarine with methodical precision. Dealey ordered emergency deep and called for maximum speed on the electric motors, sending the Harder plunging toward the ocean floor as Japanese sonar pulses grew stronger and more frequent. At 250 feet, with the enemy destroyer directly overhead, the first depth charges began to fall. The underwater explosions were unlike anything the human body was designed to endure. Each depth charge contained 300 pounds of high explosive, designed to create devastating pressure waves that could crush submarine hulls like eggshells
or rupture internal systems beyond repair.
The first pattern of charges exploded approximately 200 feet from the Harder's hull, sending shockwaves through the water that struck the submarine with the force of a massive hammer blow. Light bulbs shattered throughout the vessel, instruments jumped from their mounts, and men were thrown against bulkheads with bone-jarring force. The hull itself groaned and creaked as steel plates flexed under pressure, while loose equipment crashed to the deck in a cacophony of metallic destruction. In the engine rooms, gauge needles danced wildly as pressure waves disrupted delicate mechanical systems. For 47 minutes, the Japanese destroyer methodically worked over the area where the Harder had disappeared, dropping depth charge patterns with scientific precision, while her sonar operators listened for any sound that might betray the submarine's location. The crew of the Harder endured this underwater bombardment in complete silence, breathing recycled air that grew thicker and more toxic with each passing minute. Dealey established silent running protocols throughout the vessel, ordering all non-essential equipment shut down and forbidding any unnecessary movement or conversation. Men communicated through hand signals and written notes, while the submarine drifted through the depths like a tomb of steel and aluminum, her crew waiting for either salvation or death to claim them. The psychological pressure was perhaps more devastating than the physical danger. Submarine warfare demanded a unique combination of technical skill, physical courage, and mental fortitude that few men possessed in equal measure. The crew members were sealed inside a metal cylinder surrounded by millions of tons of water, utterly dependent on mechanical systems for their survival, while enemy forces above them methodically attempted to locate and destroy their vessel. There was no possibility of retreat, no option for surrender, and no hope of rescue if their situation became desperate. Each man knew that a single mechanical failure, a moment of carelessness, or simple bad luck could transform their submarine into a steel coffin that would sink to the ocean floor with all hands aboard. But Samuel Dealey possessed something that transcended conventional courage, an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure while calculating tactical solutions to impossible problems. As depth charges continued to explode around his vessel, he studied the acoustic patterns and timing intervals of the Japanese attack, searching for weaknesses in their search procedures. The enemy destroyer was following standard anti-submarine protocols, working in expanding squares while maintaining constant sonar contact with the ocean floor. But these procedures had been developed for hunting conventional submarines operating at standard depths in predictable patterns. Dealey realized that by using unusual tactics and exploiting the specific characteristics of local water conditions, he could turn the Japanese hunter into hunted prey. At 0447 hours, after 47 minutes of underwater terror, the Japanese destroyer's sonar contacts began to fade. Her crew had exhausted their depth charge supply without achieving a confirmed kill, and fuel considerations demanded that they continue their patrol schedule toward Balikpapan. The destroyer's commanding officer made the reasonable assumption that the American submarine had either been destroyed or severely damaged, and that continuing the search would serve no tactical purpose. This was exactly the conclusion that Samuel Dealey had been waiting for. As the sounds of the enemy vessel faded into the distance, he quietly ordered the Harder to rise to periscope depth, preparing to demonstrate that American submarines could be far more dangerous when their crews were properly motivated. The counterattack began at 0503 hours, as the Japanese destroyer continued on her original course, with reduced vigilance and overconfidence in her crew's anti-submarine capabilities. Through his periscope, Dealey could see the enemy warship clearly outlined against the increasingly bright horizon, her crew undoubtedly celebrating their victory over yet another American submarine. But the Harder had suffered no structural damage during the depth charge attack, and her torpedo tubes had been reloaded with deadly precision during the silent period underwater. This time, however, Dealey would employ different tactics, using closer range and more aggressive approach angles to compensate for the known deficiencies in American torpedo design. The second attack developed with clockwork precision. Dealey maneuvered the Harder to within 1,500 yards of the Japanese destroyer, positioning his submarine for a perfect 90-degree angle shot that would maximize the probability of torpedo impact and detonation. At this range, even the unreliable Mark 14 torpedoes would have difficulty missing their target, while the reduced distance would minimize the time available for enemy evasive maneuvers. The crew worked with silent efficiency, their earlier brush with death having focused their attention on the deadly details of submarine warfare. In the torpedo room, weapons specialists made final adjustments to guidance systems and depth settings, while the control room team prepared firing solutions with mathematical precision. The USS Harder had been transformed by combat from a mechanical weapon system into something approaching a living predator. Every crew member understood his role in the deadly ballet of underwater warfare, from the sonar operators whose acute hearing could detect enemy vessels at extraordinary ranges to the torpedo room crews whose split-second timing could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. The submarine herself had become an extension of Samuel Dealey's tactical imagination, responding to his commands with the fluid grace of a natural hunter. This transformation from peacetime training vessel to combat-hardened predator represented one of the most remarkable achievements in military leadership and engineering integration that the Second World War would produce. At 5:07 hours, Dealey fired a single Mark 14 torpedo from tube number 3, sending the weapon racing toward the Japanese destroyer at 46 knots with deadly precision. This time, everything worked exactly as designed. The torpedo's gyroscopic guidance system maintained perfect course control. Its depth mechanism kept the weapon at optimal running depth, and its warhead struck the enemy vessel's machinery spaces with devastating effect. The explosion tore through the destroyer's hull plates like paper, igniting fuel lines and ammunition storage areas in a cascading series of secondary detonations that transformed the enemy warship into a floating inferno within seconds. The Japanese destroyer Minazuki, a veteran warship that had served the Imperial Navy with distinction since her commissioning in 1937, disappeared beneath the surface of the Celebes Sea in less than 4 minutes. Her crew of 240 men had no time to launch lifeboats or transmit distress signals before their vessel's structural integrity failed completely. The submarine that they had believed destroyed was still very much alive, and Samuel Dealey had just demonstrated that American underwater warfare capabilities had evolved far beyond Japanese understanding. But this was only the beginning of what would become the most extraordinary submarine combat patrol in United States Navy history. Word of the Minazuki's destruction spread through Japanese naval communications with the speed of electronic transmission, but the full implications of the loss were not immediately understood by Imperial Navy commanders. A single submarine kill, while tactically significant, did not necessarily indicate a fundamental shift in underwater warfare capabilities or American tactical doctrine. Japanese naval intelligence continued to maintain that their destroyer screens provided adequate protection against submarine attacks, and that losses could be attributed to individual operational failures rather than systematic vulnerabilities in their anti-submarine procedures. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. Samuel Dealey had recognized something that escaped conventional military thinking. The psychological impact of successful submarine operations often exceeded their tactical value by enormous margins. Japanese naval operations throughout the Pacific were based on assumptions of technological superiority and tactical invincibility that had been cultivated during years of unopposed expansion. The destruction of a single destroyer by an American submarine operating in supposedly secure waters would create ripple effects throughout the enemy command structure, forcing defensive redeployments and conservative operational procedures that would ultimately prove more valuable than the physical destruction of individual vessels. The intelligence-gathering aspects of submarine warfare provided strategic advantages that extended far beyond simple ship-killing capabilities. Every successful attack generated detailed information about enemy procedures, response times, communication protocols, and tactical doctrines that could be analyzed and exploited in future operations. The crew of the Harder were not merely warriors, but intelligence collection specialists, gathering data about Japanese naval operations that would prove invaluable to American strategic planning throughout the Pacific theater. Their periscope photographs, radio intercepts, and tactical observations would contribute to a comprehensive understanding of enemy capabilities that gave American forces decisive advantages in subsequent operations. On the morning of June 22nd, less than 24 hours after destroying the Minazuki, sonarman Chester Hoyle detected another Japanese destroyer approaching from the southeast. This vessel was identified as the Hayasami, a newer and more heavily armed warship whose crew would presumably be alert to submarine threats after receiving reports of the previous day's attack. But Samuel Dealey had spent the intervening hours analyzing Japanese tactical procedures and identifying exploitable weaknesses in their anti-submarine protocols. The Imperial Navy's confidence in their technological superiority had created blind spots in their operational thinking that could be turned to American advantage. The attack on the Hayasami demonstrated the evolution of American submarine tactics, from crude torpedo attacks to sophisticated naval warfare combining stealth, deception, and precise timing. Dealey positioned the Harder in shallow water near a thermal layer that would confuse enemy sonar readings, while using local current patterns to mask his submarine's acoustic signature. The approach required navigating through underwater terrain features that would have challenged the most experienced peacetime submarine commanders, but combat had refined the crew's skills to levels that peacetime training could never achieve. Every man aboard the Harder had developed an intuitive understanding of underwater warfare that transcended mechanical proficiency to approach genuine artistry. The second torpedo attack achieved even more spectacular results than the first. Dealey's improved firing solution struck the Hayasami in her forward magazine, triggering an ammunition explosion that broke the destroyer's back and sent her to the bottom within 90 seconds. The massive detonation was visible from the Harder's periscope as a pillar of flame and smoke that climbed hundreds of feet into the tropical sky, while secondary explosions continued for several minutes as the enemy warship's remaining ordnance cooked off underwater. No survivors were observed, and the speed of the vessel's destruction suggested that few, if any, of her crew members could have escaped the catastrophic structural failure that followed the torpedo impact. Japanese naval communications, intercepted by American cryptographic services, revealed growing alarm within the Imperial Navy's command structure as reports of submarine attacks multiplied beyond acceptable loss rates. Radio traffic indicated emergency redeployments of anti-submarine assets and implementation of new patrol procedures designed to counter what Japanese commanders were beginning to recognize as a fundamental shift in underwater warfare capabilities. But these defensive measures were based on conventional anti-submarine doctrine that had been developed for hunting traditional submarine operations, not the innovative tactics that Samuel Dealey was pioneering in the waters around Borneo. The psychological warfare aspects of submarine operations were becoming increasingly apparent as Japanese crews began to exhibit signs of acute stress and tactical hesitation when operating in areas where American submarines had been active. Destroyer captains, who had previously operated with aggressive confidence, were now implementing defensive procedures that reduced their operational effectiveness while providing American submarines with additional tactical opportunities. The mere possibility of submarine attack was forcing Japanese naval forces to adopt conservative strategies that limited their strategic flexibility throughout the region. By June 23rd, the USS Harder had been operating in enemy-controlled waters for nearly 72 hours, far exceeding the typical duration for submarine patrols in hostile territory. Standard naval doctrine required submarines to withdraw after completing their assigned missions or when their presence had been compromised by enemy action. But Samuel Dealey recognized that his tactical success had created unique opportunities that justified extending his patrol beyond conventional limits. The Japanese destroyer force had been disrupted to such an extent that continued aggressive action might achieve strategic results that would justify the increased risks to his vessel and crew. The third attack, launched against the destroyer Tanikaze on the afternoon of June 23rd, demonstrated the full potential of innovative submarine tactics when combined with superior crew training and mechanical reliability. Dealey had identified a tactical vulnerability in Japanese formation procedures that allowed him to position the Harder inside their defensive perimeter without being detected by sonar or visual observation. The attack run required navigating through a complex underwater obstacle course of coral formations and varying depth levels that would have been impossible for less experienced crews to negotiate successfully. But the men of the Harder had been transformed by combat into specialists whose skills exceeded peacetime training standards by enormous margins. The torpedo strike that destroyed the Tanikaze represented the convergence of American industrial capability, tactical innovation, and individual courage that characterized the best aspects of United States military performance during the Second World War. The Mark 14 torpedo that sank the Japanese destroyer had been manufactured in factories across the American Midwest by workers whose dedication to quality control and precision engineering had overcome the technical deficiencies that had plagued early war production. The guidance systems, warheads, and propulsion mechanisms that enabled the weapon to find its target represented the culmination of decades of research and development by American ordnance specialists, whose innovations would prove decisive throughout the Pacific campaign. But mechanical excellence alone could not account for the Harder's extraordinary success in the Celebes Sea. Samuel Dealey had created something approaching tactical genius by combining unconventional strategic thinking with absolute confidence in his crew's capabilities and an intuitive understanding of enemy psychology that allowed him to anticipate and exploit Japanese defensive weaknesses. His willingness to operate in shallow water where conventional submarine doctrine considered attacks impossible had created tactical opportunities that enemy commanders never anticipated or prepared to counter effectively. The destruction of 3 Japanese destroyers in as many days had created strategic implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Imperial Navy logistics planners were forced to implement emergency reinforcement procedures that disrupted operational schedules throughout the Pacific theater, while defensive redeployments removed critical assets from other combat areas where American forces were conducting simultaneous offensive operations. The psychological impact on Japanese naval crews was equally significant, as reports of successful submarine attacks created an atmosphere of apprehension and defensive thinking that reduced the effectiveness of aggressive tactical procedures. American naval intelligence was simultaneously conducting comprehensive analysis of intercepted Japanese communications to assess the broader implications of the Harder's combat patrol. Radio traffic indicated that Imperial Navy commanders were beginning to recognize that American submarine capabilities had evolved beyond their previous understanding, requiring fundamental changes in anti-submarine procedures and operational doctrine. But the speed of tactical developments in underwater warfare was exceeding the Japanese ability to implement effective countermeasures, creating opportunities for American submarines throughout the Pacific to exploit similar tactical innovations. On June 24th, the 4th day of what would become known as the Harder's legendary patrol, sonarman Chester Hoyle detected not 1, but 2 Japanese destroyers operating in close formation approximately 8 miles northeast of the submarine's position. Intelligence analysis suggested that these vessels were part of an emergency response force dispatched from Balikpapan to locate and destroy the American submarine that had been terrorizing Japanese naval operations in the region. The enemy warships were identified as the Asashimo and Kasumi, both modern destroyers equipped with advanced sonar systems and depth charge batteries specifically configured for anti-submarine warfare. Samuel Dealey recognized that attacking 2 destroyers simultaneously would require tactical procedures that had never been attempted by American submarines during the Pacific War. Conventional doctrine emphasized single-target engagements that allowed submarines to withdraw immediately after firing their torpedoes, minimizing exposure to enemy counterattacks. But the presence of 2 enemy warships created unique opportunities, as well as unprecedented dangers, particularly if their crews could be manipulated into interfering with each other's anti-submarine procedures through careful timing and positioning of American attacks. The twin destroyer engagement would demonstrate the ultimate evolution of American submarine warfare from simple torpedo attacks to complex naval operations requiring coordination between multiple weapon systems, precise navigation through dangerous underwater terrain, and split-second timing that left no margin for error. The crew of the Harder had been refined by combat into specialists whose individual skills complemented each other with mechanical precision, while their confidence in Samuel Dealey's tactical judgment had reached levels that allowed them to execute impossibly dangerous maneuvers without hesitation or second-guessing. The attack approach required maneuvering the Harder into position between the 2 Japanese destroyers, using underwater terrain features to mask the submarine's acoustic signature while calculating firing solutions for targets moving in different directions at varying speeds. Dealey's tactical plan called for firing torpedoes at both enemy vessels within a 90-second window, then using the resulting confusion and defensive reactions to escape detection while reloading for potential follow-up attacks. The execution of this plan would require every crew member to perform his duties with absolute perfection, while operating under combat conditions that had already claimed numerous American submarines throughout the Pacific theater. At 13:47 hours, Dealey fired 2 torpedoes at the Asashimo from a range of 1,800 yards, then immediately swung the Harder's bow to port and launched 2 additional weapons at the Kasumi before the first torpedoes had reached their target. The submarine's torpedo room crew had achieved reload times that exceeded factory specifications by significant margins, while the control room team calculated and executed firing solutions with the precision of mechanical computers. The 4 torpedoes raced through the water on converging courses that would bring them to their targets within seconds of each other, creating a coordinated attack that the Japanese destroyer crews were completely unprepared to counter. Both destroyers were struck virtually simultaneously, their hulls penetrated by American explosives within 30 seconds of each other, as massive detonations tore through their machinery spaces and ammunition storage areas. The Kasumi's forward magazine exploded with such violence that her bow section was completely severed from the main hull, while the Asashimo suffered catastrophic flooding that overwhelmed her damage control capabilities within minutes. Neither warship had time to launch effective counterattacks against the Harder before their structural integrity failed completely, sending both vessels to the bottom of the Celebes Sea with all hands aboard. The double destroyer kill represented a tactical achievement that had no precedent in submarine warfare, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded Japanese understanding of American underwater combat potential by enormous margins. Imperial Navy communications intercepted after the attack revealed complete bewilderment among enemy commanders who could not comprehend how a single American submarine had achieved such devastating results against multiple modern warships operating in coordinated formation. Radio traffic indicated emergency conferences among senior Japanese naval officers and implementation of defensive procedures that would ultimately prove inadequate against the tactical innovations that Samuel Dealey was pioneering. But the crew of the Harder was paying an increasingly steep price for their extraordinary combat success. 72 hours of continuous operations in enemy-controlled waters had pushed both mechanical systems and human endurance beyond normal operational limits. The submarine's battery reserves were approaching minimum levels required for emergency diving procedures, while her torpedo supply was reduced to less than half of normal combat loads. Most critically, the psychological strain of prolonged combat operations was beginning to affect crew performance, despite their remarkable professional competence and confidence in their commanding officer's tactical judgment. Samuel Dealey recognized that his submarine had achieved results that justified immediate withdrawal to friendly territory, where the crew could rest and re-equip, while operational analysts studied the tactical innovations that had made their success possible. But intercepted Japanese communications suggested that additional enemy vessels were approaching the area, providing opportunities for further attacks that might achieve strategic results, exceeding the tactical value of individual ship kills. The decision to continue offensive operations rather than withdrawing to safety represented the kind of calculated risk-taking that distinguished exceptional military leaders from merely competent commanders. On the morning of June 25th, the 5th day of the Harder's extraordinary patrol, sonarman Chester Hoyle detected the acoustic signature of another Japanese destroyer approaching from the northwest. This vessel was subsequently identified as the Asashimo, an older destroyer whose crew would presumably be operating with maximum alertness after receiving reports of the catastrophic losses suffered by their sister ships during the previous 4 days. But Samuel Dealey had refined his tactical procedures to levels that transcended conventional submarine warfare, creating capabilities that enemy commanders could neither anticipate nor effectively counter through standard defensive measures. The final attack of the Harder's legendary patrol demonstrated the complete evolution of American submarine warfare from peacetime training exercises to combat operations of unprecedented sophistication and effectiveness. Dealey positioned his submarine in shallow water near underwater terrain features that would confuse enemy sonar readings while providing natural cover for torpedo attacks launched from unexpected angles. The crew executed their assigned duties with mechanical precision, their individual skills having been refined by combat experience to levels that peacetime training could never achieve. Every aspect of submarine operations from navigation to weapon firing had been perfected through repeated exposure to life-or-death situations that rewarded excellence and punished even minor errors with catastrophic results. The torpedo that destroyed the final Japanese destroyer struck her engine room with devastating precision, triggering explosions that literally broke the enemy warship in half before she could transmit distress signals or launch counterattacks against the American submarine. The massive detonation was visible from the Harder's periscope as a column of flame and debris that climbed several hundred feet into the tropical sky, while secondary explosions continued for minutes afterward as the destroyer's ammunition and fuel supplies cooked off underwater. Within 6 minutes of the torpedo impact, no trace remained of the enemy vessel except for floating debris and an oil slick that marked her final resting place on the ocean floor. Samuel Dealey had accomplished something that would have been considered impossible by naval strategists just 1 week earlier, the destruction of 5 Japanese destroyers by a single American submarine operating alone in enemy-controlled waters. His tactical innovations had created new paradigms for underwater warfare that would influence submarine operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, while his crew's professional excellence had demonstrated the potential of American naval personnel when properly trained, equipped, and led by commanders who understood both the capabilities and limitations of their weapon systems. The strategic implications of the Harder's combat patrol extended far beyond the immediate tactical results achieved through the destruction of enemy warships. Japanese naval operations throughout the Pacific had been disrupted by the need to implement emergency defensive procedures and redeploy anti-submarine assets from other combat theaters, where American forces were conducting simultaneous offensive operations. The psychological impact on Imperial Navy crews was equally significant, as the loss of 5 destroyers to a single American submarine had shattered assumptions about Japanese technological and tactical superiority that had been fundamental to their strategic thinking since the beginning of the Pacific War. But the most profound impact of the Harder's extraordinary patrol was its demonstration of what American industrial capability, technological innovation, and individual courage could achieve when combined under effective military leadership. The submarine herself represented the culmination of decades of research and development by American naval architects, ordnance specialists, and metallurgical engineers whose innovations had created weapons systems capable of projecting American power across thousands of miles of ocean. The Mark 14 torpedoes that had proven so effective during the final attacks incorporated manufacturing improvements and quality control procedures that had overcome the technical deficiencies plaguing early war production, while the submarine's crew represented the results of training programs that had refined American naval personnel into specialists whose skills exceeded peacetime standards by enormous margins. The intelligence value of the Harder's patrol provided strategic benefits that complemented her tactical achievements in destroying enemy warships. Detailed observations of Japanese naval procedures, communication protocols, and tactical doctrines had been collected throughout the 5-day operation, generating comprehensive data about enemy capabilities that would prove invaluable to American strategic planning throughout the Pacific theater. Radio intercepts, periscope photographs, and tactical observations had produced intelligence assessments that would influence American naval operations for months afterward, while the demonstration of successful submarine operations in supposedly secure enemy waters had opened new possibilities for underwater warfare throughout the region. The crew of the USS Harder had been transformed by their combat experience from peacetime naval personnel into genuine specialists whose individual skills and collective performance exceeded normal human capabilities under extreme stress conditions. Sonarman Chester Hoyle had developed acoustic detection abilities that approached supernatural sensitivity, while the torpedo room crews had achieved weapon handling speeds that exceeded factory specifications by significant margins. Most remarkably, the entire crew had learned to operate with absolute silence and coordination during combat conditions that would have paralyzed less experienced personnel, creating tactical capabilities that enemy commanders were completely unprepared to encounter or counter effectively. Samuel Dealey himself had evolved during the 5-day patrol from an exceptionally competent submarine commander into something approaching tactical genius, demonstrating innovative thinking and strategic vision that transcended conventional military education and training. His willingness to operate in shallow water where standard doctrine considered submarine attacks impossible had created opportunities that enemy commanders never anticipated, while his ability to analyze and exploit Japanese defensive weaknesses had enabled tactical achievements that exceeded established performance standards by enormous margins. The combination of individual courage, technical competence, and strategic imagination that characterized his leadership represented the best aspects of American military effectiveness during the Second World War. The broader implications of the Harder's combat patrol extended throughout the Pacific War as American submarine commanders applied the tactical innovations pioneered by Samuel Dealey to their own operations against Japanese naval forces. The demonstration that aggressive submarine attacks could be successfully conducted in shallow water and enemy-controlled sea lanes opened new possibilities for underwater warfare that had previously been considered too dangerous to attempt. American submarines throughout the Pacific began implementing similar tactical procedures, achieving results that disrupted Japanese naval operations and contributed to the ultimate collapse of Imperial Navy effectiveness in the region. But the exceptional nature of the Harder's achievements also highlighted the extraordinary human costs of underwater warfare during the Second World War. The psychological and physical demands of prolonged combat operations in enemy territory pushed both crews and equipment beyond normal operational limits, creating survival situations that tested human endurance and mechanical reliability to ultimate extremes. The men who served aboard American submarines during the Pacific War represented a small percentage of total naval personnel, but their casualty rates and operational demands were proportionally higher than almost any other category of military service during the conflict. The technological aspects of submarine warfare required mastery of complex mechanical systems, operating under conditions where single equipment failures could prove catastrophically fatal to entire crews. From navigation equipment that had to function accurately at extreme depths to torpedo guidance systems that required precise calibration for successful attacks, every aspect of submarine operations demanded technical competence that exceeded peacetime training standards. The crew members who achieved success in this demanding environment represented the culmination of American technical education and military training programs that had refined individual skills to levels approaching professional artistry. American industrial capabilities had provided the material foundation for submarine warfare success through the development of advanced weapons systems, reliable mechanical equipment, and sophisticated communication technologies that enabled complex operations across thousands of miles of ocean. The factories, research laboratories, and educational institutions that had created these capabilities represented investments in human knowledge and manufacturing infrastructure that provided decisive advantages over enemy forces throughout the Pacific War. But converting this technological potential into tactical success required individual courage and professional competence that could not be manufactured or mechanically reproduced. The legacy of the USS Harder's extraordinary patrol would extend far beyond the immediate tactical results achieved through the destruction of 5 Japanese destroyers during 5 days of combat operations. Samuel Dealey's tactical innovations became standard procedures for American submarine operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, while his crew's demonstration of professional excellence under extreme combat conditions established performance standards that influenced naval training programs for decades afterward. The strategic implications of successful submarine warfare in previously secure enemy waters forced fundamental changes in Japanese naval doctrine and operational procedures that reduced their military effectiveness throughout the Pacific theater. The human costs of submarine warfare were tragically illustrated just 2 months after the Harder's legendary patrol. On August 24, 1944, while conducting another aggressive combat operation in the Luzon Strait, the USS Harder was herself destroyed by Japanese depth charges launched from the destroyer Ikazuchi. Samuel Dealey and his entire crew of 79 men were lost, their submarine sinking in deep water where she remains to this day as a tomb of steel and sacrifice beneath the Pacific Ocean. The same tactical aggressiveness and willingness to engage superior enemy forces that had made their previous patrol so successful ultimately claimed their lives in the cruel mathematics of underwater warfare. The posthumous Medal of Honor awarded to Lieutenant Commander Samuel David Dealey recognized not only his individual courage and tactical competence, but also the broader significance of American submarine warfare operations during the Pacific War. His citation specifically mentioned the destruction of Japanese naval vessels, totaling over 15,000 tons of displacement, but the strategic impact of his tactical innovations exceeded the simple arithmetical calculation of enemy ships destroyed. The demonstration that American submarines could successfully engage Japanese naval forces in their own supposedly secure waters had psychological and strategic implications that influenced enemy operational procedures throughout the remainder of the conflict.
The crew of the USS Harder had achieved something that transcended conventional military success, demonstrating what exceptional individuals could accomplish when provided with superior equipment, adequate training, and effective leadership under the most demanding combat conditions imaginable.
Their 5-day patrol in the Celebes Sea became legendary throughout the United States Navy as an example of tactical excellence and professional courage that established performance standards for submarine warfare operations throughout the Pacific War. The men who served aboard American submarines during this period represented a small percentage of total naval personnel, but their contributions to ultimate victory were disproportionately significant. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Harder's extraordinary patrol was its demonstration of what American values, industrial capabilities, and individual courage could achieve when confronted by seemingly impossible challenges and implacable enemies. The tactical innovations, professional excellence, and strategic vision that characterized Samuel Dealey's leadership represented the best aspects of American military effectiveness during the Second World War. While his crew's performance under extreme combat conditions illustrated the potential of democratic societies to produce individuals capable of extraordinary achievement when circumstances demanded ultimate sacrifice for the preservation of freedom and human dignity. Today, more than 80 years after the USS Harder's legendary patrol in the Celebes Sea, her story continues to inspire military personnel and historians who study the tactical innovations and professional excellence that characterized American armed forces during their finest hour. The submarine warfare techniques pioneered by Samuel Dealey and his crew became standard procedures that influenced naval operations for decades afterward, while their demonstration of courage under fire established performance standards that continue to challenge military personnel in all services. Their sacrifice represents the ultimate expression of professional competence and individual dedication that enabled democratic societies to prevail against totalitarian enemies during the most destructive conflict in human history. Can you imagine the extraordinary courage required to hunt enemy warships in their own waters, knowing that discovery meant almost certain death? The legacy of the mad Texan and his crew remains alive in every submarine that patrols beneath the world's oceans, carrying forward the tactical innovations and professional standards that transformed underwater warfare from desperate gamble into precision instrument of naval strategy. These men demonstrated that exceptional leadership, superior training, and unwavering courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds when the preservation of freedom itself hung in the balance. Their story deserves to be remembered, shared, and honored by every generation that benefits from the sacrifices they made in defense of liberty and human dignity. If this account of the USS Harder's legendary patrol has moved you to greater appreciation for the courage and competence of those who served during America's greatest trial, please consider subscribing to ensure these stories of heroism and sacrifice continue reaching new audiences. Share this tribute with others who understand that freedom is never free, and that the memory of those who paid its ultimate price must never be allowed to fade from human consciousness.